It started the way most sunrises did in my life, with the soothing call of the adhan echoing through the pre-dawn stillness. I wrapped my fingers around the worn prayer beads my father had gifted me as a boy and began my Fajr prayers. Every word spoken felt familiar, dutiful, and precise. My faith was as much a part of me as my own breathing, a constant rhythm anchoring my existence. My childhood home, nestled in a quiet neighborhood of Amman, was filled with the scent of my mother's cooking and the low hum of my father reciting verses from the Quran. I was raised in a family where faith wasn't just practiced, it was lived. By the time I was 16, I had memorized extensive passages of the Quran, and theological debates became my passion. It brought me unspoken pride to sit with elders and confidently expound on Islam's truth, often dismantling the claims of Christianity with logical precision. The concept of the Trinity, the divinity of Jesus, the idea of salvation by grace, these were riddles I thought Christianity had failed to solve. Yet, as I grew older and deeper in my study of theology, a subtle but persistent unease began to shadow me. I would brush it away during the day, burying myself in the rhythm of life as a scholar and teacher. But at night, when silence overtook the house, the questions returned uninvited. Sometimes I wondered, in the isolation of my thoughts, if my good deeds were enough to justify the confidence I claimed to have on the day of judgment. Did I truly meet the standard of perfection Allah required? I would dismiss such weakness with a quick shake of my head and a whispered verse. Indeed, those who believe and do righteous deeds will have gardens beneath which rivers flow. But the fear lingered, hollow and unspoken. It was then that snippets of Christian teachings would sometimes surface. The idea of a God who came near, a God who offered forgiveness, not through toil, but through grace. I found the concept both intriguing and absurd. Forgiveness through sacrifice? Divine love as a gift? Theologically, it was laughable, or so I told myself. Deep down, I sensed it, a seed of doubt planted in the firm ground of my certainty, waiting to grow. That night, the wind rustled softly against my window as I sat cross-legged in the corner of my room. Before me lay 3 books, the Quran, a notebook brimming with my theological reflections, and, curiously, a worn New Testament that I had once picked up during a debate with a Christian professor. Its pages were untouched since then, its presence almost an afterthought in my collection. Yet tonight, in the stillness, my eyes kept returning to it. Unease twisted in my chest. For years, I had woven my confidence around the familiar framework of Islam, its rituals, its law, its discipline. Certainty was my armor, but cracks had begun to form. I leaned on the words I knew by heart. Surely, good deeds will weigh heavily on the scales. But what if I wasn't enough? Deep in the pit of my soul, I feared the judgment that awaited me. I had always assumed a scholar had nothing to fear, yet my prayers were accompanied by whispers of inadequacy. It was a fleeting thought at first, nearly stifled out of habit. What if there was another way? Like stepping too close to a fire, the idea of Christianity burned at the edge of my mind. Even entertaining such notions felt like a betrayal of my upbringing, my father's teachings, and the life I had devoted to Islam. I reminded myself that their theology was flawed, their scriptures corrupted. Yet the simplicity of their message, that God could draw near in love, that salvation was offered and not earned, lingered like the remnants of smoke. This grace they spoke of, was it too good to be true? Could there really be a God so merciful that he would stoop low enough to reach me? Or was that the kind of weakness a scholar like me was called to refute? I thumbed the New Testament's cover, but stopped short of opening it. Instead, I buried my doubt beneath whispered recitations of familiar verses. Yet the ache in my chest remained. The thought refused to retreat. If my faith was unshakable, why did I feel so shaken? For the first time that night, I wasn't sure who I was praying to, God or my own certainty. I woke up to the sun streaming softly through hospital blinds. My chest felt heavy, each breath labored as though drawn through thickened air. The muffled sound of voices outside my door mixed with the rhythmic beeping of machines. A tingling numbness coursed through my limbs as the reality set in. I'd come face to something I had never truly confronted: death's shadow. The heart attack had been sudden. One moment, I was laughing with my uncle over tea during my visit to Ahmed. The next, sharp pain radiated through my torso, crushing, relentless, a reminder of my mortality. I remembered my brother's frantic voice calling for help, the wail of a distant siren, and then the cold metal of the hospital stretcher. But most vividly, I recalled the terror that gripped me as the world dimmed around me, and I whispered the Shahada. La ilaha illa Allah. Yet something gnawed at me in the quiet aftermath. Even in my desperation, even in that sacred moment of declaring Allah's oneness, my words felt hollow. I wanted assurance, a certainty my faith had always promised but never delivered. Instead, I was left dangling over eternity, unsure of the scales that would weigh my deeds. The hours passed slowly, the minutes punctuated only by the shadow of a nurse adjusting my IV or my brother muttering du'as under his breath. My mother's face, red-rimmed and tear-streaked, appeared briefly at my bedside before she left the room, unable to hold back her emotions. I tried to pray, to focus, to reaffirm my faith in Allah's mercy, but a question surged insistently, unbidden. What if my good deeds truly weren't enough? Through my exhaustion, I was struck by an overwhelming sense of unpreparedness. It wasn't the physical suffering that terrified me. No, it was far deeper. It was what my soul might face, what awaited me should I cross death's threshold. As night fell, the room grew quieter. Somewhere within, I finally allowed myself to whisper words that had been forming for days, perhaps years. Not in Arabic, not even in certainty, but in a broken voice that barely reached the ceiling above me. God, are you truly near? Show me. With that plea, sleep claimed me, dark, yet not entirely void of expectation. The first thing I noticed was silence, a silence so profound it felt alive. The muted hum of machines and distant voices from the hospital vanished as I opened what I could only describe as an inner awareness. I hovered, weightless, above my lifeless body, gazing down upon the scene. My brother clutched my hand, his lips moving in desperate prayer. Doctors surrounded me, their movements hurried as machines beeped in sharp urgency. Panic should have gripped me, but instead, an odd stillness wrapped itself around me. It wasn't peace exactly. It was more like suspension, a liminal space, neither belonging to the inescapable noise of the hospital, nor to the nothingness I'd always imagined death might bring. Then came the light. It emerged as a pinprick far beyond what I understood. Yet it wasn't just light, it was presence. And it grew. It swelled, drawing me in like a current, pulling me toward an infinite ocean. I fought it at first, resisting the warmth hovering at my edges, terrified of surrendering. But the more I resisted, the more unyielding it seemed, enveloping me in what I could only call love. A warmth akin to nothing I'd ever experienced began softening me from within, dispelling familiar anchors of fear and doubt. This light, this presence, didn't accuse or interrogate. It beckoned. It felt as though it saw me not in flashes of perfection or failure, but as a whole, broken and longing. I found myself crying, not tears born of grief, but of release. For the first time, the suffocating weight of inadequacy was lifted. An invitation lingered within the silence, unspoken, but no less clear. Come. Yet even amidst the pull, I hesitated. I thought of my faith, my father's teachings, the call to obedience that defined my life. Was this betrayal? Was this deception? I tried repeating the Shahada as a lifeline. La ilaha illa Allah. But it slipped from my grasp like sand through fingers. The light persisted, patient and unchanging. My defenses crumbled. Before I could stop myself, I whispered into its depth, not in doubt, but in longing. "Who are you?" The presence responded, not in words, but in an unmistakable swell of love that carried me forward into its embrace. The light intensified, wrapping me in warmth that felt both foreign and deeply familiar, as though it had always been there, waiting for me to notice. From within its radiance emerged a figure whose presence seemed to quiet every part of me. He stood majestic, yet humble, with eyes that pierced through the tangle of fear, pride, and doubt within me. Though I had never seen him before, I somehow knew. "Jesus," I whispered, more in wonder than recognition. My heart surged with confusion and unease. This couldn't be. He was a prophet, a messenger, nothing more. He was not divinity. That was what I had spent my life defending, wasn't it? And yet, his gaze didn't challenge me. He didn't need to. It simply was. "You question who I am," his voice echoed, not in sound, but directly into the fibers of my soul. There was no accusation, no triumph, only love. I blinked back, scorching tears. "You—" My words faltered, lodged behind the crumbling walls of lifelong certainty. "You're just a man, sent by God, nothing more. You cannot be—" Instead of responding, he raised his hand, palm open, beckoning me closer. Images flooded my mind, not memories, but something beyond my understanding. I saw water turning to wine, lepers healed with a touch, demons fleeing in terror. And then, I saw him on a cross, broken yet radiant. The weight of the moment struck me, a sacrifice that defied comprehension. "You call me a prophet," he said, his voice like a gentle tide. "But what prophet lays down his life for the world? What prophet rises again and offers life eternal?" I stumbled over my reply. "The Quran says you weren't crucified, that you didn't die." My voice quaked under the weight of my own doubts. "Who do you trust, Ahmed?" His question reached the core of me. Scripture that falters, or the spirit that testifies even now in your heart? The light around him grew impossibly brighter, filling me with a clarity I couldn't deny. For the first time in my life, I was not arguing. I was seeing. I fell to my knees, trembling. "If this is true," I whispered, tears streaming down my face, "then show me." And he did. The light receded gently, leaving me standing on the precipice of something vast. Jesus stood beside me, his presence like a steadying hand, though he had not moved. Before us stretched a realm that seemed to pulse with life itself. Colors more vivid than anything I had ever seen shimmered in every spectrum, radiant and infinite. It was a place of profound peace, where the very air exhaled joy. Souls moved freely, untethered, their faces reflecting an indescribable contentment. "This is what it means to be with God," Jesus said softly, his voice resonating with the harmony of the place. "Not earned, but given freely. A home for those who have chosen to embrace grace." My heart swelled at the overwhelming beauty, and yet there was an ache. Where was I in this? Could I, flawed and uncertain, ever belong here? Before I could ask, the scene dissolved. The warmth evaporated, replaced by suffocating darkness. My chest tightened as screams tore through the air, a chorus of anguish and regret. A new realm stretched before me, barren, suffused with despair. Souls wandered aimlessly, shackled by unseen burdens. Their faces were twisted, not in physical suffering, but in the agony of separation. "What is this place?" I whispered, trembling. Jesus turned to me, his gaze heavy with sorrow. "This is the absence of God, a choice to reject love, grace, and truth, to cling to pride, self-reliance, and rebellion. This is the weight of rejecting what I have done." A figure stumbled toward me, its form flickering and distorted. It raised hollow eyes to mine. In them, I saw something disturbingly familiar. My doubts, my attempts to earn perfection, my fear of insufficiency. The figure collapsed at my feet, weeping, bound by chains impossible to break. This was me, I gasped, horror dawning in my soul. It would have been, Jesus said, placing a hand on my shoulder, if you had not asked me to show you. As I stood between the realms, their truths etched into my being, his voice grew tender. You see now, Ahmed, salvation is not in striving. It is not in balance. It is in surrender, receiving the gift I already gave. The weight of those words shattered me. Forgive me, I whispered, and in that moment, the darkness receded. The light and darkness faded, leaving me in a stillness neither warm nor cold. Jesus stood before me, his hand extended. His gaze pierced through every wall of certainty I had built over decades. I trembled, frozen by the invitation his hand extended, a gesture that spoke but one word: surrender. I hesitated, my entire life unfolded behind my eyes. My father's pride as I recited chapters of the Quran, my mother's whispered prayers, the confidence with which I debated Christian scholars. To say yes to this was not just a betrayal, it was annihilation of everything I had been. The implications struck me like waves. How could I face my family, my community, my students, if I dared to believe what I now knew to be true? You are afraid, Jesus said, his voice gentle but unwavering, as though my inner turmoil was laid bare before him. But fear has no claim over love. Tears surged, unbidden. I dropped my gaze, shame twisting in my chest. What happens to my family? I whispered. My father, my brothers. They've built their lives on this faith. If I accept, I leave them behind. Jesus knelt, bringing his face level with mine. Do you trust me, Ahmed? He asked softly. Not for what lies beyond this moment, not for your loved ones, not for your identity, just for who I am? The simplicity of his question shattered me. It wasn't about my past or even my future. It was about now, about him. My knees buckled as I fell to the ground, pressing my forehead against the unyielding light. I had nothing left. The walls of pride, control, and certainty were gone. I whispered into the stillness, barely audible but louder than any cry I'd ever voiced. Yes, I trust you. The moment I spoke, the light surged, enveloping me in an overwhelming sensation of peace so absolute it silenced every doubt. Jesus lifted me to my feet and placed his hand on my shoulder. Your time here is not over, he said. Go back, Ahmed. Share what you've seen. Share *me. The warmth filled every corner of my being until the stillness shattered and my eyes opened. Not to light, but to the sterile walls of the hospital room. The fluorescent hospital lights felt cold and sterile as I slowly opened my eyes. My chest ached with every breath, proof that I had returned to a world of fragility and limits. Voices stirred in the distance, my brother murmuring a dua, my mother's soft sobs just beyond the doorway, and the faint hum of monitors tracking each of my labored heartbeats. I wasn't the same, but everything around me remained untouched, as though no celestial moment had just unraveled the fabric of my being. The enormity of what had happened, the light, Jesus, and the visions, pressed against my consciousness. Yet here I lay. The weight of normalcy closed in, almost suffocating in its mundanity. Though surrounded by loved ones, I had never felt more alone. How could I explain the unexplainable? My brother, Tariq, leaned close, his eyes swimming with relief. I thought I'd lost you, he whispered. He held my hand tightly, but his grip tethered me more to what I feared than what I had seen. I nodded mechanically, unable to respond. That night, while the room grew quiet, I stared at the ceiling, replaying every detail of the encounter. The love, the invitation, the clarity. It was as though my soul had glimpsed the very heartbeat of eternity. My mind, however, returned to a quieter conflict. How could I reconcile all this with the life I knew, Every verse I had memorized, every lecture I had delivered, they weren't enough to shield me from the truth I had seen. Was I truly ready to follow? I reached for the bedside table, fumbling for the New Testament I had once dismissed so easily. The hospital gown felt stifling as I whispered, "Show me again." My hands trembled as I opened to the Gospel of John. The words felt alive, like light pouring into the shadows of my doubt. "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I closed my eyes, my heart beating not with confusion, but with a burgeoning certainty. This was no longer about doubt or faith as I understood it. It was about surrender. And for the first time, I knew in my heart who held the scales of eternity. I sat across from Hassan at the dimly lit cafe we'd frequented since university. The glass of tea between my hands was untouched, its warmth paling in comparison to the fire coursing through my chest. My heart raced, though I tried to appear calm. "I need to tell you something," I said, my voice low and unsteady. Hassan smiled, unaware of the storm within me. "After what you've been through, I'll listen to anything you have to say, Habibi. You gave us all a scare." I hesitated, the weight of my confession pressing down harder than I anticipated. Opening this door would change everything. I would not be the same, neither would my relationships. But I couldn't keep silent. Jesus' presence still lingered in my soul, steady and unyielding. To deny what I had seen would be to deny him all over again. "What if the truth isn't what we've always believed?" I asked carefully. Hassan frowned, leaning back, his eyes narrowing. "Ahmed, what are you saying?" I saw him, Hassan," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Jesus, I saw him. He spoke to me. He showed me things I cannot unsee. Heaven, hell. He showed me that salvation isn't about earning it. It's a gift, something freely given through him." For a long moment, silence fell between us. Hassan's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief. "Jesus? As in Isa, the prophet?" I nodded, my throat tightening. "No, Hassan, more than a prophet. Everything we were taught to reject, his divinity, his sacrifice, it's true. Allah, God, sent him to do what we could never achieve on our own." Hassan leaned forward, his voice sharp but hushed. "You've lost your mind. Are you hearing yourself? This is blasphemy, Ahmed. You're talking like a Christian." I met his gaze, my own swimming with unshed tears. "I know how it sounds, but I can't deny what I experienced. I can't this time. He's real, and he's calling me to share it." Hassan exhaled deeply, his hands running through his hair. "You're playing with fire. The community won't forgive this. Your family won't forgive this." "I know," I whispered, trembling but resolved. "But this is the truth, Hassan, and I have to follow it." The room held a fragile stillness as I stood before the gathering in my family's living room. My father sat at the head of the group, his back straight, his expression unreadable. My mother clutched a tissue, dabbing at the corners of her eyes. My brother Tariq stood in the kitchen doorway, arms folded, his jaw tight. Hassan sat near the window, avoiding my gaze. Others, friends, neighbors, and even a local imam, filled the space with an intensity that made the air feel suffocating. All of them had come because of me. "I have something to say," I began, my voice trembling under the weight of the moment. My prayer beads, worn smooth by years of devotion, hung limp in my hand. I hadn't let them go, not because they were anchors to my past, but because they reminded me of the journey that had led me here. For years, I had spoken in rooms like this with unwavering confidence, lecturing, debating, defending my faith, with reason sharpened like a blade. But today, I felt like a child brought before his elders, bearing news he neither fully understood nor could eloquently justify. "I had an experience," I continued, my eyes darting to my father and the flicker of anger he struggled to conceal. "You all know of my heart attack. What you don't know is that during those hours, I saw something, someone." The murmurs began, hushed and urgent, like wind building before a storm. The imam squinted, leaning forward as though scrutinizing me for deception. My father's hand tightened on the armrest of his chair. "I saw Jesus," I said plainly, my voice breaking. "He spoke to me." The room erupted. Some rose to their feet, their words sharp and accusatory. My mother began to cry openly, burying her face in her hands. Hassan locked eyes with me, his face pale. My father stood, his voice booming above the noise. "What madness is this, Ahmed? Have you forgotten everything I raised you to believe?" he demanded, trembling with restrained fury. "I haven't forgotten," I said, steadying myself. "But I can't deny what I've seen. He showed me that salvation isn't earned, it's gifted, through him." There was only silence. And though their eyes burned with rejection, I found peace. Not in their approval, but in his presence. As I stood in the courtyard of the small community center, a gentle breeze rustling the olive trees around me, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come and how far I still had to go. A year had passed since the day my world shattered and reformed in the light of Jesus' truth. Life after that encounter had been the most challenging and rewarding journey I had ever known. My father had forbidden me from entering his home, the weight of his disappointment cutting deeper than any blade. My mother's tear-streaked face haunted my prayers nightly, and Hassan's wary, distant eyes reminded me of the relationships I'd sacrificed. I couldn't blame them. Everything I'd once believed had crumbled, only to be rebuilt. How could I explain this transformation? Yet amidst the heartbreak, glimmers of hope peeked through the cracks. Tariq, my younger brother, had called me not long ago, his voice heavy with curiosity. In private, he admitted he'd started reading the Bible, comparing it to what we were raised to believe. For the first time, I heard in him the questions that had once haunted me. "Do you really think this Jesus? That he loves me too?" Tariq's words echoed in my mind even now. They were hesitant, fragile hope born from years of doubts I too once carried. At the community center tonight, I stood before a small group of seekers, Muslims, Christians, and others unsure of where they belonged. The dialogue wasn't about accusation, but discovery. I shared how seeing Jesus didn't nullify everything I was raised to believe, but fulfilled it. Jesus didn't erase my past, he gave it meaning, I told them, clutching the worn New Testament I now carried everywhere. The grace I found in his love wasn't something I earned, but something I received when I surrendered. I thought I had to be perfect to find God. What I learned is God already came near to find me. As the group dispersed, I looked to the heavens. Every rejection, every loss, it had been worth it to bring even one soul closer to him. God will guide you, but I promise you this, it's worth it. If you've been touched by my story, if you've felt a stirring in your heart, I encourage you to seek Jesus. Open your heart to him, and he will meet you where you are. Thank you for listening to my journey. If you'd like to share your thoughts or ask for prayer, please leave your name in the comments below. And if you're curious to hear more stories like mine, check out the videos on your screen now. Each one is a testament to the power of faith, grace, and God's unending love.